Madam Vice President, on behalf of KU Leuven, on behalf of all of us, on my personal behalf, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to you, or should I say, welcome home. 3 years ago, in 2018, you were awarded an honorary doctorate in this very hall at our university, and by kindly accepting that honor, you became a member of our community. At least that is how we like to feel, and it feels good. This doctorate was awarded for your outstanding performance in the field of EU competition policy, a policy that continues to produce many scholars around the world, also at our university. I think these scholars are among the most grateful you can meet, but more importantly, they are full of respect and admiration for your work and for the way you communicate about this policy and its decision. By the way, my congratulations on the Google case. Today, we are moving into your other responsibility, the digital one, which figures among the big strategic choices of the European Commission. The very profound digital evolution, or shall we say revolution, we are experiencing since the middle of the 20th century has drastically changed many aspects of society, ranging from our private lives to the way entire economies are structured. Questions like technological singularity, intelligence explosion, or software bottlenecks continue to frame discussions on the future of humanity itself. So, and you know that phrase, making the European Union fit for the digital age. Your responsibility as an executive vice president is not a small responsibility. With your lecture, we are also moving into the transatlantic context, and in this regard, I am tempted to remind the audience of a story that was picked up by the principals of the America-Europe Fund, with whom we cooperate for this event today. After fighting against Apple, President Trump told then Commission President Juncker at a G7 meeting in Canada in June 2018 that, quote, and I'm not good at imitating Trump, "Your tax lady, she really hates the US." And when reporters asked you later about that comment, you responded, according to the story, with your usual calm. "I've done my own fact-checking on the first part of the sentence, and yes, I do work with tax, and I am a woman, so this is 100% correct. But the second half of the sentence is not correct," you added, saying, "I very much like the US." I could multiply this testimony to your professionalism, your calm, and your sense of apropos with many other testimonials on your talents and human qualities, not least by your former ministerial colleagues working with you in the ECOFIN Council, the monthly meetings of the Ministers of Finance and the Economy. You successfully chaired that council and this powerful group, we can say, during the Danish EU presidency of 2012. Madam Vice President, you may have picked up that upon the opening of this academic year, I have made remarks evidently on the pandemic, but also on the need to protect freedom of academic inquiry and freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is worth little if it applies only to those views we find easy to stomach. Nowhere should this be truer than at universities. Yet universities are now at the front line to fight for it, including those that are very highly ranked in the Academic Freedom Index, which is the case for this university. In this context, I think we can agree that debates are rarely won by not being held. The best path to victory for any individual or group facing a problem by expressing opinion is not to silence debate, but to address it head-on. It is an important issue, and it connects with a critical value in Europe, a protected value, and an essential building block within the transatlantic community. I understand these values, like many others, are very close to your heart, And I know these values travel with you whenever you reach out and make important trips abroad, like the one you are preparing for Washington later this year. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by explaining some house rules for our proceedings. This lecture will be live streamed, is already live streamed, and I understand we have more than 1,600 registered participants online. I welcome you all, also those attending this speech online. There will be a Q&A for the more or less 300 audience people present here physically. Please start thinking about your questions. The Q&A is moderated later on by Ambassador Dirk Wouters. Dirk, thank you for that. Dirk is also chairing the Europe America Fund. I thank him for his recent initiatives at our university and the support for our North America strategy. The closing remarks will be made by Marianne Thijssen, former colleague in the European Commission of Vice President Vestager and currently President of the Board of KU Leuven. She has been very well prepared at the European Commission for that responsibility, I assume. Yeah. Madam Vice President, thank you again for your very precious time. Please, may I invite you to deliver your lecture. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me home. Because this is more than a beautiful venue. It's a home of talented students, amazing professors, a heart that makes things happen in the rest of the body of our society. So thank you very much for this. And it makes a lot of sense to be here at this time of year. Yesterday marks the 103 years since the end of the First World War. This city, this university, this very building were first-line witnesses to the horrors of that war. The medieval university library, like so many other things in the patrimony of the city, was burned to the ground. Leuven also witnessed Europe building back after a tragedy, and did so with a helping hand from the Atlantic, or from across the Atlantic more precisely. And I guess it's well known to everyone here how the National Committee of the United States for the Restoration of the University of Louvain collected donations from around America to rebuild the library and its collection with the wonderful design of architect Whitney Warren. And this gesture of transatlantic generosity speaks to the depth of the ties that binds us together. A common history, shared experiences, shared value, and of course, this enduring belief that the future can always be made better. Today, as we emerge from the pandemic, we are also at this moment of renewal. We renew our economies, we renew our societies, we make us ready, we make us fit for the green and the digital transition. It has begun, but we have so much more work to do. And we also renew our transatlantic partnership. After 4 years, sort of in all openness, they were not at their best shape. And what a year of renewal 2021 has been. The EU and the United States held the first formal summit since 2014. We have settled long-standing disputes over aircraft subsidies, steel and aluminium. We have launched joint initiatives both on climate and on health. And last weeks of September, I had the honor to co-chair the first ever EU-US Trade and Technology Council in Pittsburgh from the EU side with my colleague Valdis Dombrovskis. And only 2 days ago, President von der Leyen met again with President Biden in Washington, D.C. to take our common agenda forward. And this deepening of transatlantic ties, it comes at the very, very right time. The world is changing, rival systems of governance emerging. The EU and US can shape the rules of the road for the 21st century based on common values: democracy, open and competitive markets, free choice, equal opportunities, indeed, the freedom of speech. But achieving it, setting the rules of the road for this century, will not be easy. We face tensions, obstacles, of course, as we pave our way. For instance, at the height of the pandemic, Europe's vaccine manufacturers, they were not able to source their components from, indeed, the United States, creating shortfalls in production here at a time where this was a question actually of life and death. And this brings me to my main theme today, the importance of trustworthy transatlantic supply chains for our economics and for our partnerships. Obviously, the European Union has benefited enormously from open trade. 1 in 7 jobs in Europe, well, they depend on exports. Transatlantic trade alone supports 8 million jobs. Our openness is and will remain an asset for our union. At the same time, the pandemic taught us that, or how, dependencies in strategic sectors can become a weakness, especially in times of crisis when you need them the most. Shocks to the market, even political decisions taken outside of our borders, well, that can disrupt the supply of really essential products when they are most needed. And this is why the Commission set out to identify, to map areas of strength and areas of vulnerabilities. And last May, we presented the results of our analysis. It was more than 5,000 different products that we went through. Out of these 5,000 different products, we found 137 where the European Union has a strategic dependency from third countries. And from these 137, and you would guess these are raw materials, these are active ingredients in pharmaceuticals, these are essential chemicals. Analyzing these 137, we found that only in 34, the market cannot be expected to solve the dependencies alone by diversification, by innovation, by CEOs and boards making sure that they know where to supply also critical issues. And this is why we need to focus our action on indeed these 34 different areas. And actually the US, they did the same. They also did a supply chain review, announcing in June a range of initiatives to boost domestic capacities. And the areas they focused on, well, they largely overlapped with the areas identified by the Commission. And this, of course, I think begs the question, as both sides set out to boost our industrial base, well, how do we turn our interdependencies into a source of strength rather than a source of friction? how do we safeguard economic security for our respective markets without losing the benefit of the largest trade and investment relationship in this world? As we think about future crises or changing political landscapes, how can we create the trust really needed in order to be able to rely on one another? And all of these questions, they come to the very forefront when we look at the question of semiconductors. These itsy-bitsy tiny miniature components, well, they power every device that we rely on in our lives. And right now, there is a serious shortage. Whether you're in the market for a PlayStation 5 or a new car, whether you know it or not, you need semiconductors. And for businesses that depend on them, well, the shortage can destroy profits, undermine their place in the industry, their access to the market. There are many factors behind the shortage that we experience right now. From increase in demand coming from homestay during the pandemic, geopolitical tensions that leads to hoarding of supply, especially in China, to business decisions in some companies to cancel supply contracts, only, of course, to find themselves at the back of the queue when demand picks up again. One thing I think is important, of course, to realize that in this context, both the US and the European Union have set targets to expand innovative capacities in design and manufacture of semiconductors. On our side, the European Chips Act will increase transparency and ensure a better coordination of supply chains. But one thing is, I think, quite obvious. No matter the level of investment, this will not solve the immediate shortage because it takes quite some time to increase capacity. And that means that we must use the lesson learned about what created the shortage and have a long-term perspective when deciding on investments. And Europe has important strengths to bring to the table. We lead on manufacturing equipment for chips. We're at the forefront of research and innovation. Thanks, I think, in great part to this university, this city. Also, of course, the contribution that IMEC makes as a world-class center. But in order to make the most of strength, in order to leverage our strengths, we need to invest in them. And a good example are what we call important projects of common European interest. We already have one in the area of semiconductors, a new one in the making. And the idea here is to bring companies and member states together to address challenges that are too big for an individual member state or indeed individual companies to solve alone, because there are high risks involved in that kind of projects, because they are cutting-edge innovation. With a second project now in the pipeline, we ought to be able to stay at the cutting edge of innovation when it comes to semiconductors. And that can be innovation both of the scale of chips, but also on other parameters. And a really crucial parameter is the energy efficiency. Because one cannot look at our digital transition without looking at the green one at the same time. And we need to get in control of the energy use of everything digital. Which means, of course, also energy efficiency in chips is of the essence. And investing in innovation is key. Otherwise, I don't think that it is possible to stay competitive, or for that matter, to increase our production of semiconductors. And much attention has been focused on leading-edge semiconductors. And I do think that it makes a lot of sense for Europe to aim to produce the coming most advanced chips that we see on this planet. That would be down to the 2-nanometer node. But that's not our only focus, because Europe's industry needs reliable access to a wide spectrum of chips. It's not only the tiniest one, it's also other sizes with other capabilities. And this, of course, is to enable industry to be in the lead, both of the green transition and the digital transition. When we look at the build-up of connected cars and vehicles, when it comes to connect all kinds of devices to the internet. And for all of this to work, we need access to global markets. And we need to know how to manage our interdependencies with other parts of the world, including, of course, and that is key, with the United States. I see 4 different principles behind strong partnership for resilient supply chains. The first step towards cooperation is transparency. Governments should only take action on the basis of complete information. Within the European Union, we have launched a semiconductor alliance that brings all different stakeholders together in order to create this transparency. That we know the ecosystem, we know who is doing what, we know who rely on each other. And at the first meeting of the Trade and Technology Council, we agreed with the United States to share the outcomes of our assessments in order to jointly identify gaps, vulnerabilities in the supply chain. So create transparency in sharing our insights. That's a very important first step, because otherwise we fly blind. The second is to keep markets open. Self-sufficiency is an illusion. When you think about the scale of what is needed, I think it becomes quite clear that no country, no company can do this alone. Of course, it is estimates, qualified guessing, but maybe $350 to $420 billion. That is what the US semiconductor industry estimates is needed as an upfront investment to cover all domestic demand through a fully self-supplied, self-sufficient supply chain, if the US were to go alone. For the EU, this figure would be between 240 to 330 billion euros upfront. And that kind of money would, of course, mean one thing: well, more expensive chips and a negative impact on all kinds of markets. But as the pandemic has taught us, fully segmenting markets, with each region specializing in just one part of the supply chain or one type of semiconductors, that is not the right answer either. We cannot be self-reliant, neither can we just do one or few things in this important market. So it's about to find the balance. Our aim should be diversification among like-minded partners to build resilient supply chains that we can rely on and, of course, avoid single points of failure. Thirdly, we really need to avoid a subsidy race, a race that leaves everyone poorer off. And, of course, in the present circumstance, it may be a temptation too hard to resist for companies to try to play governments out against one another, scanning the landscape to see who will be willing to pay more. Well, the risk, of course, is letting taxpayers, whether European or American, picking up the bill and getting maybe very little from that investment. And EU state aid control comes here into the picture as part of what will help us avoid a subsidy race. Because what we can aim for is to secure the level playing field of the single market. State aids may be absolutely justified, but only if it is necessary for a project to get off the ground, and provided that competition distortions are minimized and that benefits are widely shared without discrimination across the European economy. And this is also why the European Chips Act will provide a coordinated EU approach, because this is for all of us in Europe, not just for the few. And this is why strong coordination with our trusted partners, including the US, will make a big difference. Fourth, in order to build such a trust, we need sufficient guarantees of the security of supply. Restrictions imposed during COVID, well, they were not always proportionate. And they showed that there is a need for much better coordination. We need to give industry a stable, a predictable environment so they can make their long-term business decision based on trust in the supply chain. And of course, in order to do that, we need the reassurance that we can continue to rely on our partners, obviously, especially in times of crisis. And even if the political landscape changes in their governments. So the obvious question here, you don't have to contemplate that for the Q&A, because the obvious question is how? How to get that kind of guarantees? How to be able to rely on partners knowing that in a crisis you have a sense of urgency and knowing that the political landscape can change here or there. Well, these are my initial reflections to answer that question as to how. And they don't just apply to the international or transatlantic relationship or to semiconductors. They apply actually across the board. First, we need to keep order in our own house. The pandemic showed that even within the union's internal borders, the risk of restrictions is still present, even when crisis strikes. Even when we need each other the most within the union, you saw that borders closed. And this is why next year we will propose a single market emergency instrument with the aim of avoiding fractures in the single market when future crises happen. And for me, internationally, the same logic would apply. We need to start thinking about how to develop an international supply chain emergency instrument. It would consist of a commitment between like-minded partners to keep supply chains open to one another to the maximum extent possible in times of crisis. And of course, for such a commitment to be meaningful, it should have a strong factual basis. Joint vulnerability assessments based on common standards or common definitions of what is actually essential goods. Better visibility of potential shocks by stress testing supply chains and sharing information on a timely basis. Effective early warning mechanism to avoid surprises when difficulties arise, because this is the point where surprises are not at all welcome. In addition, we need to cooperate towards compatible long-term strategies for investment in order to achieve the principle of supply chain resilience that I just took you through. And we need coordinated export controls to help protect security while ensuring prior consultation and, of course, managing what might be of unintended consequences to the actions taken. If we are able to develop these tools, and if we are able to do it with our partners, we will be so much closer to a resilient supply chain that our economies need, both for the green future, but definitely, obviously, for the digital one. The next meeting of the Trade and Technology Council will take place in spring. It will be here in Europe. And now that we have things up and running, this will be a test as to how far can we take this approach forward. And I think that if it's based on trust, and if it's based on the common values of two old, strong democracies, well, then we can go quite far indeed. We should also advance discussions with other like-minded partners. The Supply Chain Resilience Summit that President Biden chaired in Rome on the 31st of October was a good start. And this work must go on, building consensus, building trust, building more common ground. And we must use the opportunities that we have ahead of us to make durable progress and find agreement that will outlast the crisis of tomorrow. Because the story of the library here is also a warning to avoid complacency. Just 12 years after the library was rebuilt, it was destroyed a second time, as Europe once again fell into the darkness of war, even more deadly, horrible than the first one. And the lesson we took is that something that defines the European Union even to this very day. Maybe it can be summed up. It is twice as hard to fight for peace and prosperity as it is to fight a war. But it's so much more worth doing it. Thank you very much.
Madam Vice President, thank you so much. On behalf of all of us, and you heard that we are more or less 1,900 in total to listen to your very interesting lecture. Thank you so much. You covered a wide range of subjects, the more positive trajectory in the EU-US relations that is going on, the strong signals, the whole question surrounding trust, what exactly it does mean, or it could mean, the question of the resilient supply chains, semiconductors, all the projects of common European interests, and then, last but not least, the principles you mentioned on the way it might work. So thank you for touching upon this wide range of issues. So I suggest that now we see which kind of questions will be addressed to you. And may I remind the audience about the simple rules of Q&A. If you want an answer, just ask a question. If you want to be recognized, please identify yourself. I will keep an eye on the clock, as promised. And if there are several questions, more than one, I will try, for the benefit of the Vice President, to group them. So who would like to break the ice? I know that there are two mobile micros with hostesses going around. So who would like to go first for this Q&A after this most wonderful lecture by the Executive Vice President of the European Commission? So I see a lady, or here, maybe we can start here because that's closer, Professor Kolja Raube. And then I have a lady there on the right. So if somebody can bring the mic, or maybe Professor Raube, you can do it like if you shout, we can hear you. We can hear you. No, for the audience, just go. Yeah, please. You bring, and then can you bring the second mic? Over there. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Madam Vice President, for your very interesting speech and words. May I come back to the Google case on Wednesday, which you didn't address that much because it was not really in the picture, but I tried to bring it into the picture by asking you the question, to which degree you think that the antitrust fines imposed on big tech companies help the EU to draw back the influence of big tech monopolies in the digital market, and whether more effective EU legislation, in fact, you mentioned the Digital Market Act, will help us towards that. And perhaps, if I may add to that, can, so to speak, we know you all have a passion for knitting, right? So my question is whether you see any possibility that we could knit something together with the US in that respect, that in fact there can be in the new Trade and Technology Council an effort to knit together towards a more global rule book for big tech. Thank you very much.
I suggest we start with this one, and then I will take two more afterwards. Thank you.
Well, thank you for bringing it up. It was indeed a very important judgment by the General Court Wednesday. You will know that the Google shopping case was the first ever antitrust case against Google. So really important that the court confirmed our findings. The thing with the individual cases is that the fine is not enough. The fine is there to punish past behavior. The second element is, of course, in such a decision to say to a company, stop what you're doing and don't put anything in place that has the same effect. And last but not least, how to repair. And especially when it comes to digital markets, of course, this is of the essence because illegal behavior by a company that's dominant in the market can really, really ruin the opportunities for other businesses, and they can do it very fast. So the repair work is something that we have pushed for the Google Shopping case, that rivals of Google Shopping can have a presence in the shopping box, that merchants who work through these rivals actually can get to their customers. And I think by now, 75% or something like that, actually of products come from merchants that works with rivals of Google. But we have had not one, not two, but 3 Google cases that we are done with. We have now a 4th about the Google ad tech stack. We have 3 Apple cases. We've had already 1 Amazon case. Now we have 2 more. So what I have learned from that is that case-by-case enforcement is not enough. Because as said, a lot of harm can be done if one of these dominant companies basically closes off the market for others or make it very difficult. And this is why we have suggested what we call the Digital Markets Act. And the Digital Markets Act would say to some of these big companies, well, if you are really big, then we consider that the market power you hold is the market power to keep the gate to that market open or closed. And the Digital Markets Act would tell these companies to keep the gate open. Because we need many more companies based on their own ideas, their innovation, their work ethics, what constitutes a company, for them to be able to get to potential customers without that being decided by a gatekeeper. And I have a lot of trust in making this work, because once you're designated a gatekeeper, this is the list of things you cannot do, and these are the lists of things you must do. For instance, make sure that smaller companies get their data, and that you just not keep them for yourself. So I have a lot of trust in this combination of vigorously enforcing competition law and having this regulation. And the good thing is that we meet a lot of enthusiasm both in Parliament and in Council. So if hardworking and lucky, we can get it into effect by 1st of January next year, so pass it during the French presidency. The fascinating thing about knitting is that with your hands, you can make something that is so much stronger than the individual thread. You know, a thread is easily broken. Once you have knitted it, you have a fabric that is flexible, subtle, and yet strong. It's not really possible to tear it apart. So it's a really, really good metaphor. And one of the things that we discussed indeed during the first meeting of the Trade and Technology Council were platforms. How to figure out how to work together, how to push some of these open market agendas to a bigger extent than what we do today. And the interesting thing is that when you look at the Digital Markets Act, you find something quite similar now being discussed from a bipartisan perspective, also in the US Congress. So yes, I do indeed think that we can push further, because over the years there's been created an alignment of thinking when it comes to digital markets, when it comes to how should big tech behave in order for that market to stay open and innovative.
Thank you so much. Interesting idea, transatlantic knitting now. But I think I will take at least 3 questions now to group them. So the lady there on the right hand, yes, I think this is, do I recognize Nadia Krotel? Is that correct? Please go ahead, and then afterwards, Professor Vestager. Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Vice President, for sharing your insights today on resilient supply chains, especially in the very critical semiconductor sector. My name is Nadia, also home at KU Leuven. My academic background is in international relations, and hence I'm very inclined to ask the very short question to avoid, in order to attract global manufacturers of semiconductors and chips, how do we avoid bidding war amongst nations worldwide, in the spirit of cooperation that you were just mentioning? Thank you.
So we have a question here by Professor Vestager, please. And then can you bring the mic to the gentleman?
So I'm Renilde Vestager, professor at the Faculty of Economics and Management. Thanks a lot for your excellent talk here. It builds a lot of trust in your capacity to do EU policy making. So my question is on, so you emphasized the importance of transatlantic relations for resilience and strategic autonomy, to keep markets open, to coordinate on regulation, to coordinate to avoid subsidy wars. But there is also another big elephant or big dragon in the room here, and you mentioned also to collaborate with other like-minded. Can you say something more about, is China sufficiently like-minded that you could also build similar relationships with them as well?
Thank you. Another third question.
Yeah, good morning. Robert Boete, Faculty of Economics and Business. Thank you very much for the very interesting lecture. I have a question relating to the transparency that you put forward as a way for resilient supply chains. Now, I totally concur that we should have more transparency within the supply chain. And I also think it goes beyond the semiconductor market, is because we fear the shortage, and we see companies that are ordering much more than they actually need to get at least a part of that short supply. Now, my question is, how can we motivate, how can we incentivize companies to share that information? Because you can share information within one supply chain, but inevitably you're also sharing information with your competition. So how are we going to motivate, incentivize? What are the initiatives that we can do to build that transparency and to share that information within and across the different supply chains?
Thank you so much. So 3 questions: transparency, supply chains, China, and how to avoid the subsidy race.
Well, it is, I think to some degree we're all invited to this subsidy race. And of course it can get, you know, the blood running, and there is a sense of, you need to get there, and you need to bid higher, otherwise you're not in this market. And I think part of avoiding it is, of course, to take the drama out and to put facts and, you know, sort of strategic thinking in as to what can be achieved. And I think the only way to really avoid a subsidy race is indeed that we can see that we can work with others in order to have these resilient supply chains. Because if we get into this sort of frenzy and the drama of we need to do everything ourselves, otherwise we're doomed, then of course it becomes really tricky to think straight as to what do you actually get when taxpayers invest. I do think that subsidies may indeed be needed here. We see the wonders they work already in the important projects of common European interest that we have already. When it comes to the first one on microelectronics, the two we have now on batteries. So there can be very good uses for subsidies when they are under control, when they are necessary, when they are proportionate, when they indeed are used to create also a spillover to those who may not get the subsidy. Because that's the problem in any project. Not every company can be part of it. So the companies who are not part of the project, how do they get access to knowledge? And for instance, in one of the battery IPCIs, we have this governance structure where companies who do not participate, they get access to knowledge. Smaller companies can get access to testing facilities so that they get, part of the benefit because we have this sort of pan-European perspective. I think these are some of the roads to take. In the same vein, actually, on the question of transparency, well, transparency comes from exchanging information. Exchanging information can also be a cartel. Actually, it's kind of the recipe for a cartel. We just had one on 5 big car makers deciding among themselves not to clean fumes from diesel cars to a higher level than what the law required. So no competition on producing the cleanest possible car. At the same time, they also had a number of other interesting discussions about safety measures, for instance. So what we did in the decision of this case, or in the process of this case, was we fined them for their illegal behavior, I think 875 million euros, and we told them what we thought was perfectly fine. So we gave comfort on the kind of information where you say, super, we find it legitimate that you exchange this, we will not come chasing you thinking that this is a cartel. And at the same line of thinking, we have sort of a set of criteria for the different alliances that we create right now. And an alliance is indeed the different stakeholders coming together. So we make a setup where you can safely exchange information without being afraid that all of a sudden you're in a sort of EU-approved cartel, because that doesn't really work. And we work quite a lot of this, and we also invite businesses to come to us if they want us to give guidance as to how to make a setup where you can exchange information without that being something that we would then think of as cartelizing. And I think that is very important because obviously here we are in a gray zone where something is legitimate and something actually is leaning on to being a cartel. So that we find to be very important to have that interaction because we need both. We still need competition among some of these suppliers. As said, we want these diversified supply chains, but we also want the transparency in the market for clever decisions to be taken. When it comes to China, the previous commission that I was part of made an EU-China strategy that still holds. And in that strategy, we characterize our relationship to China in 3 different ways. As a partner, when it comes to fighting climate change. Without partnering with China, we will not be successful. I think they are 37% of global emissions. We are 11. So obviously, we need to work together to achieve it. Second, we see China as an economic competitor. There are Chinese companies that compete with European, American companies all over this planet. So of course, there is some kind of economic competition. But last but not least, we also see them as a systemic rival, because China is not a democracy. And we try to frame this. This is, of course, a complex relationship. And we need to work with China within the framework of that complex relationship. But one of the main differences for me, as I took you through it in my speech, is what makes it obvious to partner with the US is that we share the fundamentals. We are old democracies. The starting point is the integrity and the dignity of the individual. And that makes it so obvious to lean in that direction. That doesn't exclude different ways of working with China, but it makes it really obvious to create something in common with those partners where we share the fundamentals.
I think there is just time for one last question. Yes, I think you were first, gentleman. Oh, can we take two?
Yes?
Okay, let's take, so in the back, please.
Thank you, Mrs. Vestager. I am Gilbert Druant, once a student at this alma mater a long time ago, May '68. My question is, our relations with America are historical. That's true. America is a good friend of ours. But we all know that famous sentence, it's better to have a good neighbor than a friend far away. What about our relations with Russia?
Can we have another one? Yes, there was another question, I think, and that will be, let's do the last one. If that's okay.
Yeah, thank you for the very interesting lecture. You mentioned in your response to the first question about the market power of some big tech companies and about how it is they can protect their markets and make it more difficult for competitors to enter in the market. And you said they should be sharing information. Economists now are saying maybe data and should become more collective, public good. And I wanted to know your opinion about that, whether data should be a public good shared for all competitors and all companies to then innovate further. Thank you.
Well, I don't know if these two questions are related, but there's one about Russia and one about data as public good. And this was the last round of questions. Please, Vice President.
I think you probably has a point in saying that it's better to have a good neighbor than a friend far away, but it would be ideal to have both. The relationship with Russia obviously is a complicated one because we have the ongoing sanctions due to the Crimea takeover, and I think it's important to develop that relationship with a pace that is followed by change so that we can actually mirror ourselves in what is happening. Because as it is now, it is a difficult relationship. The relationship on that border is difficult. It's difficult for the countries with the border up till Russia, because they have the overflying of Russian fighter jets. And you have, European fighter jets being in a NATO framework also having to take off. So I think it's an important neighbor, but it's also important that we stand our ground as to what we believe in. And that, I think, is even more important than we think. Because sometimes we're a bit timid about what it means to be European, as if it wasn't great. We have something really spectacular going for ourselves in Europe. And maybe we should promote that more, not only towards Russia, but also in the discussions with a Chinese model and with our partners in the US. Because it is as if we sometimes, I think, underestimate the power of our societal model. That inequalities are still relatively low, that education is for free, that the health system is for everyone, that there is an innovative entrepreneurial culture, that there is an industrial, not only history, but also very, very strong future. And I think no matter if it's a relationship with a friend or with a neighbor, it's really important to be more assertive about who we are. And I think there's plenty of room for Europe to show more. And that also goes for the way we handle data. Europe was the first to pass privacy legislation. And now that is being followed up all over the planet, more or less as we speak. In the Indian parliament, they are in the process of passing legislation on privacy. In many US states, they are passing legislation on privacy, taking the inspiration from Europe. And by starting here, obviously I also say, no, I don't think all data should be common good. Because I think that the data that you create yourself, they are yours. I would like you to be able to donate your data or to make your data available, but I would like every one of us to be in control. And a way to share data and to make them available is indeed to have data intermediaries. So neutral entities that can take data in and allow others to use them. And we're just in the process, the final process, of passing legislation to make that happen. We're also in the process of creating what we call a health data space, and it's a metaphor for data being pooled, but at the same time that the necessary conditions for privacy is being upheld. Indeed, for data to be available for innovation. But I think it's a balance, because the fundamental principle when it comes to data is that they belong to the one who creates it. And then we can do a number of different things with it, and right now we're in the process of setting up data sharing, data altruism, all these different possibilities. And of course, publicly created data for a very long time have been made also publicly available. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, dear friends, the concluding remarks are by Marianne Thijssen. Please, Marianne, please.
Honorable Rector, Madam Vice President, Your Excellencies, professors, students, ladies and gentlemen. Dear Margrethe, on behalf of the KU Leuven, I want to thank you for your time, for your excellent speech, and for your participation in the Q&A session. You rightfully value the transatlantic EU-US relationship, and the Trump era has taught us why. The Biden administration indeed provides an opportunity for a renewed partnership, key to both partners' security and prosperity, a better understanding of each other's sensitivities, and a broader cooperation in international affairs, from the global pandemic over social security challenges to climate change, the rise of other global competitors, the global supply chain. How time flies, dear Margrethe. I remember when we both started at the European Commission under President Jean-Claude Juncker, he said at our very first college meeting, I will not tolerate stars in my meeting. And I recall that you did not agree. You said, Mr. President, we are all stars, and that's all right. We all need to shine if we want Europe to excel. You were right, of course, and you are certainly a star. At communication, for instance, like today, you are able to talk about Europe in a way everyone understands, even on the most complicated topics. And as we all know, good conversation starts with listening. a skill that you also master well. You were also a start at digital from the start, from the beginning of your mandate, your first mandate as Commissioner for Competition. You were not afraid to take on the big tech giants, Google, Facebook, and the other ones who followed. Based on sound political and legal judgment, embedded in European values, in the European values-based legal order, as the European judges last Wednesday in their last Wednesday's ruling confirmed. But your decisions were about much more than competition law. You showed that no one in Europe is above the law. You showed people, consumers and citizens, that Europe stands up for them. And that's important, because in the end, people is what Europe is about. And in the von der Leyen Commission, your star shines even more brightly as Executive Vice President, that's a long name, with new added responsibilities for setting the strategic direction for the policy priority of making Europe fit for the digital age, which is a central one. Digital change affects our economy, our society, and our democracy. We cannot and should not stop these changes. Robots and algorithms will also create opportunities and growth and jobs, as you just told us. There will be progress in medicine, in science and technology, in the way we learn and educate, in being truly international. In many ways, the future looks bright, and KU Leuven is up to the challenge. In the end, we have to make sure things change for the better, and there we all have our mission. We have work ahead. I would fall short of my obligations as a former Commissioner for Work and Social Affairs if I would not take the opportunity to remind you all of the importance of digital in terms of social policies. It not only affects how we live, but also how we work. And that's why we established the European Pillar of Social Rights and why we launched the European Skills Agenda. Dear Margaret, I trust that you will continue to keep an eye on these dimensions as well. Madam Vice President, honored guests, Europe faces many challenges: digital, corona, climate, migration, social. We know what we have to do, and now we have to do it. We have to shape the future, or the future will shape us. We have to shape a Europe that can shape a better world. In doing so, we must stick to our values. Our values must guide our trade and socio-economic policies. Our values must decide our digital policies. And we know, Madam Vice President, that this is what's always also guiding you. So let me thank you once again, dear Margaret, for accepting the KU Leuven invitation. Continue your excellent work. On behalf of the KU Leuven, I wish you all the best in this important endeavor. But of course, we don't want to let you go without a small thank you gift, and therefore I invite, I think, Professor Vice Rector Peter Lievens and also Dirk Wouters of the Europe America Fund. Thanks again.